Well, good morning everybody, and welcome to this virtual meeting of FREP. In accordance with government regulations, we're holding this meeting on a virtual basis with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. I'll call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session. They will also introduce each guest as they join us. Members of the public might like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyFire for this meeting. Can I ask everyone to check their electronic devices are switched to silent mode and their microphones are switched to mute when they're not talking to avoid any interruptions. Before we move on to the formal meeting, I'd like to take this time to remember the victims, their families and all of those affected by the Grenfell Tower fire. On Sunday it will be 3 years since the horrific event and we're all still mourning. We also want to thank the firefighters and other emergency services who acted under enormous pressure on that night. Their bravery will always be remembered. Our main item today is a discussion on the COVID-19 Strategic Coordination Group and the impact of COVID-19 on the London Fire Brigade's current and future services. But first we have a few short items of formal business to go through before we begin that discussion. So can I ask our clerk, Dan Richards, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting and to confirm those members who are participating.
Thank you, Chair. The committee members in attendance on the call are yourself, Assembly Member Dismore, Chair of the Committee, Assembly Member Hall, Deputy Chairman of the Committee, Assembly Member Arbour, Assembly Member Cooper, Assembly Member Curtin, and Assembly Member Dr. Moore, and there are no apologies for this meeting.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 on declarations of interest? Can I ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests and other relevant interests, including any declarations in relation to gifts and hospitality, which are not reflected on the authority's register of gifts and hospitality, where they relate to the items on the agenda for today's meeting?
Noted and no.
Okay,
no.
Thank you. Membership of the committee, can I ask members to note the membership and chairing arrangements?
Noted.
Thank you. And terms of reference, can we note the committee's terms of reference as on the agenda?
Noted.
Thank you. Standing delegations, can we note the standing delegations of authority to me, the chair of the committee, as set out in the agenda and as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 15th of May 2020?
Noted.
Noted. Minutes, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting on the 5th of March 2020?
Agreed.
Thank you. And can we note summary of list of actions? Can we note the outstanding, completed and closed actions arising from previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence listed in the report?
Noted and agreed.
Thank you. Action taken under delegated authority. Can we note the recent action taken by me, the chair of the committee, under delegated authority, following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's response to the government consultation in regard to the review of the ban on the use of combustible materials in and on the external walls of buildings?
Noted.
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 Good, right. Well, that brings us to our main item of business, a discussion on the COVID-19 Strategic Coordination Group and the work of the London Fire Brigade at this time. So can I welcome our guests, Dr. Fiona Twycross, Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, and Andy Rowe, London Fire Commissioner. We also have in attendance Richard Mills, Deputy Commissioner for Safety and Assurance at the LFB, Sue Budden, Director of Corporate Services, LFB, Susan Ellis-Bunce, Assistant Director for Strategy and Risk, LFB, and Tim Powell, Assistant Director of People Services, LFB. Thank you all for coming. And can we now go to the main business, therefore? And I think that Fiona and Andy want to make some brief opening remarks. So, Fiona, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me to this meeting today. I'd particularly like to say welcome to Assembly Member Moore to the Assembly and Assembly Member Arbour to this committee. Much has happened since I last met this committee formally, and I'm here today as Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience and the Chair of the London Resilience Forum to both talk about the work of the Fire Brigade and also about London's response to COVID-19, a disease that has effectively turned all of our worlds upside down. As the Chair rightly said, today it is just 3 days until the 3-year anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire. It's a fire that should never have happened and remains a tragedy of such magnitude that I personally still find it difficult to comprehend. Today and over the coming weekend, our thoughts and prayers are with the families, friends and community who are grieving and remembering their loved ones. This anniversary comes in difficult and very different circumstances to last year. But no matter what the circumstances, as Londoners, we can never forget the 72 people who tragically lost their lives in the Grenfell Tower fire. To set the scene more generally, if a reminder is required for where we are now, COVID-19 remains the most significant public health crisis our city has faced in living memory. And while this is primarily a health emergency, the economic and social impacts clearly pose huge challenges which we must overcome as a city. While we'll be talking today about some of the issues, including no doubt lockdown easing and transition arrangements, it's important to stress that the virus has not gone away. I want to personally thank Londoners who've made monumental sacrifices over the past few weeks and followed the rules. I urge them to continue to do so to help save lives. I've been the Mayor's representative on the Strategic Coordination Group. I've been involved in coordinating the response to COVID-19 on behalf of the Mayor, alongside London's emergency services, local authorities and the government to ensure that the plans are in place for our city to respond to this public health crisis. I want to thank the Chair of the Strategic Coordination Group, John Barradell, who has carried out this role tirelessly and extremely well over the past few months. And I want to pay tribute to John and his co-chair, Eleanor Kelly, for all their hard work on behalf of London and Londoners. We're now moving to new structures to support and address the health, economic and social challenges posed by COVID-19, which I'm sure members will want to discuss further through the meeting. While the work of the SCG has been ongoing, my responsibilities in relation to the London Fire Brigade have also continued. And I've worked closely with the Commissioner and his team as we face the COVID-19 response through the Fire Brigade's lens as well. I know the Commissioner will be talking in much more detail about the challenges and changes the COVID-19 crisis has made to the day-to-day running of the brigade. However, at this point, I would like to say how proud I am of the brigade for how it has stepped up for London during this crisis. Over 300 brigade staff have volunteered in roles that have helped save lives and maintain the dignity of the deceased who've tragically passed away as a result of the virus. There's a lot to cover in today's meeting, so I'll leave my remarks there for the moment and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Andy, you're not on the screen yet, but do you want to make your opening remarks, Commissioner?
I do, if I manage to get myself off mute. I'd like to start really firstly thanking the committee for the opportunity to present the Fire Brigade to you for your scrutiny and your questions. I welcome that, as I always do. And again, I would like to welcome Tony, I think formally onto the committee, and I look forward to what I know will be forensic questioning moving ahead. And again, a big hello to Alison, who I was privileged enough to meet for the first time virtually the other day and had a really interesting conversation. So welcome to you both. And thank you for taking the time to support London and Londoners in the scrutiny you bring to bear on myself and my organisation. I'm going to start just by reflecting, perhaps as Fiona had started and Andrew, on the fact that we near the 3rd anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, and my thoughts and the thoughts of my organisation are very much with the bereaved, the survivors and the relatives. And I'm so grateful to have met some of those families, because that meeting and those conversations are the thing that keep me most motivated to drive the change I know must happen in the London Fire Brigade to ensure that no Londoners ever face a tragedy on that scale again. And I accept full responsibility to ensure those changes are made in light of the recommendations that fell from both the inspection report and the Grenfell Tower inquiry. And despite the challenges of the current period in relation to COVID-19, that change has not stopped. It is still my key priority, and it must not stop in the context of this tragic anniversary. And then I think the only other thing I would like to say is to place on record my thanks to the fantastic men and women of the London Fire Brigade who have demonstrated once again in their quality, their courage and their endeavour that they are always there when London and Londoners need them. You know, they have stepped forward in great numbers to, you know, reach out to the communities they serve and support them in a time of crisis, whether that's the 300 firefighters I have co-crewing ambulances, whether it was the 150 odd firefighters I had providing dignity at end of life to those people who tragically lost their lives in their own homes, or whether it's to my members of staff who run our logistics network that have taken on responsibility for delivering PPE across local authorities in London, and only last Friday delivered their 10th million piece of PPE. I think it demonstrates that regardless of the great institutional change that must come to the London Fire Brigade in its culture, in its systems, in its way we lead people, the way we train people to ensure a tragedy like Grenfell doesn't happen again, we must never doubt the quality of our people, and that therefore that change is so important to ensure we honour their commitment, their courage, their endeavour, their loyalty, their service to London. And I think I would like to leave it there, Chair, and as ever willingly open myself up to the questions of this committee to ensure I am held to that promise. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Commissioner. And obviously there's still a job to be done in rebuilding confidence of the Grenfell community in the Fire Brigade. And I think you've made a very good start in relation to that. And I think what is particularly tragic is the stats that came out this morning about the number of tall buildings still awaiting remediation. 300 nationwide are still with ACM. And for the first time, the government have published regional figures which show that there are 247 unremediated buildings in London, of which only 34% have seen works begin, and only 50 have been fixed so far. And most of those are overwhelmingly in the private sector, so there's still a huge job to be done. The government did set June, i.e. now, 2020 as a target, and it's clearly not going to be reached. So there is still a huge job to be done in making Londoners who live in tall buildings safe in their homes. But I want to go on to start, Fiona, with the Strategic Coordination Group, and perhaps I could ask you in what ways the SCG has developed over the past few months as the pandemic evolved, what's been the main challenges, and are there any plans to put the SCG on a more permanent footing with funding attached?
Thank you, Chair. As you'll be aware, the SCG has now been up and running for 3 months. So this is an unprecedented length of time for an SCG. It's not really the normal structures that we'd have for an SCG. So it has developed over time. Very early on, we recognised, I think it was the first formal meeting of the SCG, it was recognised that the health emergency had system-wide implications. So it became a body that was chaired by John Barradell with Eleanor Kelly as co-chair, to reflect the system-wide impacts. As it's gone through, the subgroups and the priorities and the risks that have been prioritised by the SCG have reflected the emerging risks and priorities that have come up through the pandemic. And I think that the SCG will, I think we're using the term morph into the transition management group that will sit under the transition management board as part of the new longer term arrangements. And this will ensure that we have things on a sound footing, and longer term we're looking to have people on longer term secondments rather than sort of on a more ad hoc basis. So I think we've done a lot of preparatory work for the next phase. The SCG is still up and running, at least for the next few weeks, while we see what the implications of the easing of lockdown remain. But it is planned for us to move into a more firm footing as the Transition Management Board as we enter into the next phase, with the proviso that should things require it, the SCG will be stepped up again to deal with any future waves should that be required.
Well, I think those are two important issues I want to come back to. But before I do that, just looking back briefly over the last few months, when did the SCG become aware that the spread of coronavirus in care homes was a major problem? And what were the major obstacles to improving protections for care home residents against the virus?
I don't have the precise date for when the SCG first discussed care home, but throughout, as it has been in the media, the issue of care homes and the need to plan for care homes has been discussed. It has been something that's been a strand of work through the SCG. So what was the second part of that question, Chair?
What were the major obstacles to improving protection for care home residents?
I think that I don't have specifics on that. I'd suggest that the major obstacles in terms of care homes would probably be the something that you might like to talk about with those people who've been leading that particular strand of work. So I think that the issue for care homes is clearly that they tend to house the most vulnerable people. So the SCG has really been focused on making sure that the most vulnerable people are protected, and actually sort of making sure that care homes got the PPE that they needed was one of the key strands of the work that the LFB has led on through distribution of PPE and making sure that you get protection across that. And clearly at the moment we've now got the additional test and trace in care homes, where we're looking at making sure that whether you're asymptomatic or symptomatic in care homes, you have additional testing available to make sure that we can address things as they arise, that they can be addressed as they arise, and that you look at sort of protecting care homes going forward.
Okay, well, perhaps you could drop us a line on the detail that going back.
No, I can do that, yeah.
Which you can't answer now. I mean, that really brings me to the next question, is what documents has the SCG produced in relation to the impact of various lockdown easings would have in London, and to what extent has the government taken that into consideration?
Well, the government's represented on the SCG through the government liaison officers, so they have been a key part of the discussion through the SCG. We've currently got a senior officer from the Met who's been working on looking at what the implications are of lockdown easing. We don't have formal published documents, but the government would have seen all the documents, as well as being part of that ongoing discussion about the risks associated with the easing of lockdown, particularly in London, where we've got a very high reliance on public transport, for example. And we do believe that the issues highlighted around public transport, both through the SCG and by the Mayor, have influenced the government in respect of the advice they've now come out with on face coverings on public transport.
So there haven't been any formal documents at the SCG on the impact of lockdown easing?
Yes, no, I thought I'd said that there had been. So there have been regular documents to the SCG on lockdown easing through a piece of work specifically on this by the Met. And the GLA's also been doing considerable work on lockdown easing, which these documents have been fed through to government through the government liaison officers.
And are those documents confidential?
Yes, they'd be classified as official sensitive.
Okay. So what are the key challenges in London for the easing of lockdown, and how's the SCG supporting test and trace?
Yes, so the key challenges, as I mentioned, are around the public transport and the reliance we have on public transport in London. So I think that the reliance of London on transport is quite considerable, clearly, and that means that our challenges are different to other parts of the country, not least in relation to the reliance on public transport for people getting to work. So I think that that's one of the key challenges. I think that the other challenge is really the how you get the balance right between protecting people, protecting public health, and making sure that London can get back to a semblance of normality. And clearly, public health has to be at the heart of this. The health of our of Londoners has to be at the heart of this. But we also need to make sure that we do look at the at how we get the economy back and running. So I think that the test and trace will be a vital part of this. And I think that the making sure that we get the local plans right, so that where local government's been asked to get their own plans in place for future outbreaks, so you get those localised outbreak plans, that sort of making sure that those sit comfortably alongside the testing process, but that's sort of ramped up, and that people understand the importance of following the advice they're then given if they're contacted about self-isolation will be key. And we've seen that where countries have successfully come out of lockdown, is that sort of test and trace approach is vital.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, my two boroughs, Barnet and Camden, are both participating in the first stages of this. And one of the things that I think is quite key to this is the question of the app, which has been trialled on the Isle of Wight, and which the government seems to have gone very quiet about. We haven't heard anything about that for about a month, I don't think. What's happening in relation to the app?
I understand that it's due to come out in the autumn. What I would say about the app is it's only one aspect of the test and trace programme, and actually it's the calls and the call centres where you've got people who are getting in touch with people have been contacted by is the most vital part of it. When we get an app that works, I think we'll all support it, and we'd be looking to the Assembly to be part of a cross-party push to make sure people take up the app. But we had raised concerns that the app, although it might work on an island, may not work. It's reliant on Bluetooth. You actually need to get that right. I mean, we can all imagine what would happen if you have a tab lock where you're reliant on Bluetooth. You might get inaccurate readings, or people who aren't actually having been in contact with people being told that they've come into close contact with people. So I think it's more important that we get the app right for when we need it for the autumn than that we rush it out before we're ready. I think that the test and trace and isolate sort of programme is not reliant on the app, nor should it be, because we can't have a system which is entirely reliant on people having the right technology and downloading an app to protect the public. It will be a useful arm in that when we get to that stage of the outbreak going forward.
Okay. The London Resilience Forum is having an interim review this month. Can you give us some more detail on what that's going to include and who's going to be involved and what the timescales are?
So the LRF is actually meeting this afternoon. So we're going to discuss people's initial views on the first phase at that. The LRF itself is looking at the longer term implications. So what we can learn from it for sort of similar events or sort of learning in the future. I'd say a lot of it's quite technical. It's about the sort of physical aspects of how you work in a pandemic, how you actually manage to do those communications, the sort of the technical side of things. What I would say from the perspective of somebody who's had the honour of chairing the LRF for 4 years now is what I'm going to say to the LRF this afternoon is how grateful I am for everybody in terms of doing their work. It is important that we learn lessons for the next phase, but I'm also going to take the opportunity to thank people for an incredible effort in which people have really driven forward the London response in very difficult circumstances. One of the things I noted when I was reading through the LRF minutes in preparation for the meeting this afternoon is actually at the meeting in February, we signed off a COVID-19 framework, response framework that reflected the flu pandemic, but actually sort of adapted that for how we might see it for COVID-19. I think emergency planners' advice would always be that the plan never really, an emergency never exactly follows the plan. And we've relied on a number of different plans to carry out the response. So, but the review itself focused on learning across 3 areas. So initial learning for organisations, cross-sector learning where there's interdependencies between subgroups or organisations, and learning related to structures and operation of the SDG and TCG as a system. So the cross-sector or system-wide learning will be discussed and embedded by the SCG to review and action prior to any future waves, and initial discussions took place on that yesterday. And the LRF review is really focused on the learning for this and subsequent incidents. So we're looking at longer term issues that will require decisions potentially on funding, responsibilities and structures for future incidents, where we've seen over the last few years that we've actually had a number of incidents that required a much longer term response than we would normally expect for civil contingencies incident.
So what are the key learnings that you think will be taken away?
I'm reluctant as chair, who's going to chair a discussion on this later, to prejudge the discussion this afternoon, but I'd be happy to brief you and others from this committee informally afterwards, if that's helpful.
Well, I think that would be helpful. We were talking about having another informal sometime in July, so perhaps
yeah,
we could...
I think that would be helpful, and what I would suggest is that I'm not chair of the SCG, so it might be helpful to involve John Barradell in that discussion as well, so you get that sort of round discussion about all the issues in the round.
Okay. And the last question from me before I bring Tony in on the next section. If there were to be a second outbreak in London, what will be the SCG's role in implementing a localised lockdown?
That's not really for the SCG. I think that would be local authorities in discussion with PHE. So I think on that, the SCG would potentially have an oversight role to make sure that the local outbreak plans are working on a London-wide basis. They wouldn't have a direct role in that. That would be down to the boroughs in discussion with PHE, although quite clearly the SCG, the Transition Management Group, and the government liaison officers would be keenly interested, as would I, in how those work in practice.
Yeah, okay. So can we move on then to Tony, who's going to talk about the LFB Transformation Delivery Plan. Tony.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Chairman. It's nice to be back. I first was connected with fire, of course, with the old Fire Brigade committee at the GLC, and I have to say that there certainly has been a transformation from those days. I wonder, Commissioner, if you can tell us what has actually happened, given that, if you like, the normal process of change has been interrupted by COVID, but what has actually happened with regard to implementing the transformation plan?
So actually, work is progressing across the entirety of the action plan against that detailed action plan you've seen. So of the original 65 actions in the plan, good progress is being made with 19 actions now completed, which includes the cultural audit, definitions of the leadership requirements, a review of the organisational structure and fundamental change to our structures to a 4-directional structure now, the appointment on June the 1st of Fiona Dolman, our Transformation Director, the review of governance, an alignment of the 3-year ICT strategy with the Transformation Delivery Plan, and provision of long-term support to the government's building safety programme. Obviously, some activities have inevitably been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, but it hasn't stopped work being progressed. It's rather, we've started from the position of not what do we stop, but how do we deliver it differently. I would suggest the most significant delay, though, is the delivery of training to support the revised policies for high-rise firefighting, fire survival guidance, and the new emergency evacuation and mass rescue policy, which obviously causes me some anxiety in the context of the risk picture that exists in London. But that's inevitable because good delivery of those policies and our incident response based on it is manifest in very large-scale group training, face-to-face training. So the delivery of that suite of training, which now includes both CBT and practical elements, we're working it up in this new environment with perhaps virtual reality doing part of it, and most importantly, now agreeing with colleagues in the representative bodies how we are going to resume face-to-face group training at the earliest opportunity, with some activities stepping up actually from this week. And therefore, that particular item is now due to be delivered and completed by December 2020, whereas prior to the pandemic, this had a delivery date of July 2020. So I hope that gives you a snapshot of the fact that we are progressing with energy the transformation plan. We are completing actions wherever possible, and we are seeking to change the way we deliver them if challenged by COVID-19 to ensure we do not lose progress on this.
So let me get this right. In effect, you're saying that COVID has only affected the training part of the transformation plan.
I think it's not just training. Training, I think, is the most significant issue in terms of impact, because that's the most visible piece. But if it's anywhere where we've needed face-to-face contact with people, really, to deliver parts of the plan, we've had to amend how we think. So, for example, the work around inclusion and leadership, whilst not delayed, I think would have had a greater impact earlier if we'd been able to deliver big bits of it through face-to-face engagement. Now, I think we're doing really well in terms of amending how we deal with things. So a lot of that is now happening virtually. For example, we briefed all heads of service this morning on the inclusion strategy, the togetherness strategy, which sits at the heart of the change in culture. And actually, we've seen some really positive impacts. I mean, I think it's easy to focus on delay, but other things have been brought forward. For example, I have nearly 1,000 members of staff working remotely really successfully. We will never return into our office environment in the way we did before. That's a positive change in culture. You know, our managers are reporting back to me, although it's too early to point to a real evidential shift in our culture, but they're reporting greater flexibility and willingness to adapt. You know, the fact that we've got 300 firefighters, crew and ambulances, and we secured agreement with the FBU over the process of 2 weeks, is a real indication of how change can happen when it really needs to happen. So I think it's a mix of things. I think some things have been delayed, but I'm certain that we will deliver our plan because we have to. You know, I'll take you back to my opening statement. This anniversary, this weekend, is the starkest reminder that whole sections of London communities were let down, and I will not be satisfied until that change is delivered. COVID-19 doesn't stop that.
In effect, you're saying that already, supposing, heaven forfend, that there was another Grenfell, you are now in a position, because of the actions taken under the transformation plan, to deal with the thing completely differently. Yeah,
I think we're already in a different place in terms of incident response. You know, I think good training is a continuous journey, so we will continue to build on it. So, for example, Richard has been working hard with the colleagues that he leads to plan an urban firefighting course, which might be delivered in 1.5 to 2 years' time. You know, a week-long course delivered every 2 years for firefighters, residential potentially. You know, that is absolutely world-leading if we do that. It'll take time to get there, but in the interim, I'm already very certain that if one of my incident commanders arrives at a high-rise incident tonight, they will already be in a better place to take earlier decisions around the state of that building and what they might need to do in response to it. We are all operating in a different understanding of the risk environment, and we have already started providing training in a staged way to meet that need. So actually, Richard, can I bring you in just to give a bit of detail around that stage process? Would that be helpful, Tony?
Yes, it would.
Okay, Richard Mills.
Yep, certainly, thank you. So the process that's briefly been described by the Commission, we're looking at a three-phase process. First of all, in addition to the high-rise policy, there are two other key policies that feed that. So that's the evacuation policy and that's the fire survival guidance policy. So the first phase will be computer-based training that we will roll out across the whole workforce, and that'll be 3 packages, 1 for each one. The evacuation policy being a new policy for the London Fire Brigade in its entirety. And then when we start looking at phase 2, that will be some practical application. So we are very cognizant of the fact that COVID has had an impact on how we can deliver the training. So computer-based training first and foremost, we're progressing that as we speak. And there will be, some of that will be about assessment to make sure that they're actually viewing and understanding the computer-based training that's being provided. Phase 2 will be exercise and testing. So that will be through local borough-based initiatives with high-rise buildings to allow both firefighters and officers at all levels of the organisation the ability to consolidate some of their learning through the policies that they've done. And then the Commissioner, about the urban firefighting course is an aspiration that we're working towards to look about having a training course that will allow you to reaffirm your skills as professional firefighters, whether that's every 2 years or every 3 years, which would be a protracted course to allow you to look at a whole host of capabilities, whole host of fire scenarios in a practical environment where, if possible, we have fire simulation as being key to that. One of the other things to mention is also about virtual reality training. So one of the things that has been highlighted to us, and to emphasise the point from the Commissioner, is around the way in which we carry out some of our training, particularly in this kind of environment. Virtual reality is being looked at by us currently because we recognise it not only provides advantage of some consistency of exercising, it can put people in an environment that can be monitored, recorded, and we can actually look at human behaviours and interactions in extreme environments. So exercising and testing is very expensive for those Assembly members and the Chair that came and saw the exercise took place. You know, we are reliant on the built environment to deliver us what we need. Virtual reality will allow people to test in really extreme environments for major incidents, counter-terrorism environments, anything that is unusual. So we are very, very keen to explore that. Not only will it allow us to be more cost-effective in how we deliver our training, but it will allow consistency in some scenarios that can't be simulated as effectively as we would like.
Okay, it's quite clear that you're coping. Commissioner, can I ask you that given that you're making such magnificent progress without a new director of strategy, do you really need her?
Do we need Fiona?
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
What's she going to do? What's she going to do that you haven't succeeded in doing already?
She's going to provide challenge, and she's going to provide us, I think, with the experience of having led transformation in a number of other organisations with a view that is outside of the fire service, because I think this committee would rightfully recognise that part of our problem, as highlighted in both the inquiry and the reports, is that we were too insular in our thinking and we're not open to challenge. Much of the change you're talking about is as a result of the challenge we have faced from those reports and this committee. You know, challenge drives innovation. We need someone internally who's going to provide us that rigour and that challenge and tie what is a very complicated transformation plan together and give us that expertise. I'm very clear that that is a post that was vital for us to ensure that change isn't just a one-hit programme, but is a process of continuous improvement embedded in the culture of the brigade. And I'm not sure we have the internal expertise to do that, actually.
Well, that's interesting. I think I did say at the last meeting that I attended when we were discussing this, all of this appears to be continuous revolution, and I'm not certain that that really is the way to deal with it, because of course this committee thinks that it's challenging you and is looking at it. Can I ask Susan, in respect of the 4 pillars, are we progressing equally on all of them, or is there any slippage?
Thank you. The impact of COVID is spread fairly consistently across the 4 pillars. To be honest, there isn't one that's at particular risk over and above any of the others. Some of the training impacts that the Commissioner referred to earlier appear under a number of the pillars, as do some of the engagement processes, both internal and external.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Chairman. I think that in the Commissioner's initial response, we've covered the other questions I was expected to ask. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Tony. And Commissioner, perhaps when we have our informal in July, we can have Fiona Dolman participate in that. So after a month or so, we can see what she's been able to achieve and what her plans are.
Yes, I think that would be a good idea. Thank you.
And before we move on, thank you for giving us a draft copy of the transformation plan, albeit under embargo. When do you think we're going to get the signed off version?
We're working with City Hall at the moment to clear that through the Mayor's office, because obviously we report formally to both the Mayor and to HMIC actually and to the Home Office. So there's a complex piece of governance there to enable that. And I can't give you an absolute date at this point, but I can assure you we're working to clear it at the earliest opportunity with both City Hall and other colleagues in government.
And hopefully once it's published, we can see regular updates on progress against it.
I think that's very important for this committee to see that, yes. We need to work hard to ensure there is that transparency to the progress of the plan.
And also on the metrics, I think a lot of the problems we've had before have been woods and trees. Are we going to have metrics as part of this that actually mean something?
Yes, that is one of my key priorities. I think in the past, we've consistently reported that we were meeting all of our own targets, and yet somehow we still found ourselves in this situation. The metrics that come forward need to be fewer, simpler, and far more focused on what London and Londoners need and what our service means to them. We are actually struggling and working with that now, and I think that's one of the first things that Fiona must help enable the organisation to do, to define exactly what we mean to London and Londoners and the most important elements against which we should be judged.
Okay, well thank you for that, and I'm going to bring in Alison to talk about COVID-19 and the work of the brigade.
Thank you very much, Chair. My first set of questions are for the Commissioner. I'd just like to put on record my thanks to you for having that Zoom meeting recently, because it helped me to get up to speed rapidly with some of your challenges. So thank you, and to Barnet's Borough Commander also, who enabled me to have a site visit to my local Finchley Fire Station, so suitably distanced, but thank him and his staff for their time yesterday morning. It was invaluable in preparing for this, so thank you. You touched on some of the answers in the previous section, but I'm going to ask the questions in the way I did, and you can add, if you think you've already answered them, just you can add anything else that you think is relevant. So the first question is, how has the impact of COVID-19 on staffing levels at London Fire Brigade affected the delivery of services, including some of your non-critical activities, and what planning is taking place for this work to be reinstated?
So we've got a very detailed plan in terms of stepping our core activities back up, whether that's training, whether it's our prevention work in communities, or whether it's our statutory advice in respect to fire safety. Obviously, because of the need to social distance to protect the most vulnerable in society, we stopped a lot of those activities in line with government guidance. And that is what gave us the capacity, actually, in terms of a relatively small service serving a very large city, to step into other spaces such as driving ambulances and crewing them, such as providing, dignity at end of life as part of a multi-agency team. It's my aim to continue that support as part of COVID-19's continued pan-London response. but in a different way to ensure we can step our core activities back up. And we're working, for example, with the London Ambulance Service to now build a bank of firefighters, we hope, who will work on their off-duty days, paid for by health, to continue providing support to the ambulance service. And those talks are progressing well. And we will therefore have the capacity to step those other activities up while maintaining support for COVID. I think it might be a useful time to turn to Tim now, my new Director for People. It's important I recognise his title, to talk about the impact on our staff in terms of sickness and wellness and perhaps equalities as well. Would you be able to do that for Alison, Tim? Because that's the other side, I think, of that question.
And if you could, in answering that, touch on to what extent the pre-arranged overtime continuing to be used, how suitable that is and how sustainable it is, and what the cost implications are.
Tim Powell.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Andy. Hi, Alison. So I think, at the outset of this, we understood that, there might be some significant challenges around our workforce, and we kind of contingency planned for potentially having as many as 30% of our workforce away from work, either due to sickness or due to self-isolation issues. That's never materialised for us, actually. We took a very bold decision to stand down our attendance policy at the outset of COVID-19 because we didn't want people to feel particularly disadvantaged because of an attendance policy, and we wanted people to make the right moral decisions around staying away from work if they needed to do so. And I think it's fair to say that our workforce, supported by our union, have been admirable in the way that they've conducted themselves during all of that. We haven't seen large numbers of people sick. In total, we've had 43 employees who've had a period of sickness due to confirmed COVID-19 cases. All of those have returned to work. We have 3 currently who are sick at the moment. Our self-isolation figures at the outset raised to almost 500 staff, which is about 5% of our, which is about 10% of our workforce. We've seen that periodically come down, and as we sit here today, we have 160 members of operational staff who are self-isolating due to COVID-19. We've seen a slight increase in that over the last 2 weeks since track and trace has been introduced, but again, not significant numbers. So we've managed to maintain a level of operational resilience and resilience across our administrative workforce as we've gone through COVID-19. And I think we've been able to support employees quite strongly through all of that, through really good communications internally, both to our employees and to our managers, so that they're really clear at all stages what they've needed to do if they experience symptoms, if they live with somebody who has symptoms, if they live with somebody who is vulnerable and needs shielding. And I think we've been very supportive around our workforce in that. And Deputy Commissioner Mills and I have a weekly telephone conference with the trade unions just to make sure that from their point of view, everything is in line and that their members feel like they're getting supported as well. And that's been really useful.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And on the overtime, that's been working to help that situation, I take it, because that's the pre-arranged overtime.
Yes. The pre-arranged overtime that we've put in place has helped both in terms of our own internal operational resilience, as well as helping with what Commissioner Rowe has discussed there in terms of our support to the London Ambulance Service, and that's helped quite significantly as well. And we've seen lots of staff really willingly step up to the plate in terms of that. We were worried about numbers at the outset, but again, our staff, I think, have recognised a responsibility in terms of doing this and availing themselves to to work where they've needed to.
Could I move on to what's obviously been a sensitive area?
Before you go on, Alison, you asked about the costing.
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Sue Budden's probably the best place to answer that one.
The cost implications of the pre-arranged overtime.
Yeah, it's Sue Budden. Sue Budden.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So as Tim's indicated, our usage of pre-arranged overtime to backfill for absence has been relatively low. So our current forecast is only around £100,000 for additional pre-arranged overtime linked into those staff absences. There are other staff costs for the cost of the people that have volunteered to do the ambulance driver assist and then the PMARC work that we were doing. In terms of your specific question about pre-arranged overtime to cover absence, that's quite low.
And in terms of the PSmart and other support work, what sort of costs are you looking at there?
So those costs are around 1.4 million for the volunteers that we've had working for the ambulance driver assistant and then the PMAR.
Okay, thank you.
And sorry, Sue, are we going to get any of that money back from LAS?
So as I think Richard said, or Andy might have said, as we're looking forward to extend the ambulance driver assist, we would look potentially to seek cost recovery from the LAS, and those conversations are ongoing. For the moment, there's money that you might be aware of that was allocated to the GLA from MHCLG, and then the Home Office have also got a specific pot to help FRAs around COVID-19 costs. So we're in discussion with both of them about how we might access those pots to fund the money that we've spent so far.
Thank you. Alison.
So, thank you for that prompt, Chair. The issue around PPE and testing is one that's been very current. I mean, are you content, Commissioner, that the firefighters now have access to adequate coronavirus testing and adequate PPE, and do you think that that's going to be available for you in the future?
I think they're two separate questions. I've always had confidence in the PPE because of the effort that Sue's people have put into ensuring we both identify and secure resilient supply lines for PPE. And I'm not aware of any instance where there has been a firefighter either crewing an ambulance or doing their frontline firefighting duties not having the right PPE available. And actually, whilst that's been a real challenge for Sue and in particular head of procurement, they've worked tirelessly to ensure we were able to provide that safety net for our staff. So I'm really grateful actually to Sue, and I would like to place my thanks on record there. In terms of testing, I think we are part of the bigger national picture is probably the truthful answer. And I think there is some way to go around testing before we can be confident and sure that we have both the availability in the systems that mean we can truly say our staff are confident in that. But we're working very closely with colleagues in the SCG from Public Health England, the NHS, to ensure that our people get good availability to the testing regime that is in place and making positive suggestions to how it might be improved in terms of what our staff need.
And I guess following on a little bit from that, how are you supporting the well-being of staff, including those working with other emergency services, and in particular perhaps those working with the P-Smart teams, because that's obviously an emotionally challenging situation?
So we've got a really significant psychological health offer in the Fire Brigade, and I think we've done everything we can in what's quite a challenging virtual environment to widen that and make it available to any member of staff that needs it. But maybe Tim could give us a little bit more detail if that would help you, Alison.
Okay, that would be helpful. Yeah.
Tim?
Yeah, that.
Well, I mean, we've got a well-established, well-being offer to our staff, which includes, professional counselling and trauma team, particularly in relation to the PMARTs, the people that have undertaken the PMART duties, where they have been, potentially exposed to some quite challenging situations. On the back of every shift, there has been contact made with them by a trained individual so that they can discuss their experiences and so forth. And that's in some cases led to, some proper counselling and some trauma counselling. But I know everybody's been really appreciative of the support that they've received around that. And I know that the other emergency services have looked at what we've done and are looking to replicate what we've implemented, for our firefighter crews in that regard. So, the wellbeing of, I suppose it's one of those things you're always restless about whether you can ever do enough for people. But I think, we've built in, again, in consultation with our unions, a very strong wellbeing offer to, for staff, particularly those who are doing different duties at times and have been exposed to things that they wouldn't necessarily have been exposed to during this time.
That's really helpful, thank you. And following on a little from that, how is the brigade planning post-COVID, Andy? And what work is being prioritised in terms of planning your forward activity?
So in terms of the most important part of really the brigade, which is our contact with communities, our service into communities, we've got a really detailed plan about how we step that up appropriately in line with government guidance, ensuring that both the most vulnerable in our communities and our own staff are safe in the delivery of that service. I think it's probably worth going to Richard to perhaps give you some detail on that, to give you an example of the level of detail that's gone into the planning to step up our response in stages across prevention, protection, and obviously, incident response itself.
Okay, thank you.
Richard?
So I think there's the wider piece of work that we've done as an organisation around the learning, the lessons learned about how we deliver our services differently in the future. Now, during the pandemic, we have recognised about the safety of the community and how we provide that service. There have been occasions where either we haven't had access to buildings or people haven't wanted us to access some of those buildings for various reasons, obviously because of COVID. So we've put in places things like desktop reviews around fire safety. We've got a new tool around home fire safety visits that's on our computer that people log on and do a self-assessment. We've provided our crews with the tools as part of that desktop to review, to record it on our operational database and then revisit that premises in 2 to 3 months' time to ensure that we do go back to those areas of greatest risk. We are looking to also re-implement our vehicles that we take out of service on strategic resource. So that will be re-implemented in July, and that will start to create us a capacity to increase the level of involvement with our communities. And we will start to look at about how we can best engage those communities and embed ourselves better within the community itself, but also about the process that we need to start doing about the best way to open up our fire stations again to invite the community in. It has to be very much measured around social distancing, and we'll be very cognizant of the advice that's being provided by government all the way throughout. And we will basically do it in the stages. We're very mindful that if we have a second phase of COVID, that we may need to switch some of those services off. But we do and are doing everything we possibly can to engage with the community in virtual way, whether that's through our community engagement with schools. We recently did a walk around a fire station virtually that people could download and see to help schools around coming back into the community. So there's many things that we're trying to do, but we will be doing it in stages to reflect the gradual opening up of London as well.
Thank you, because I'm conscious, particularly domestic fire safety is an area that will become increasingly a focus because you have a whole set of families in straitened circumstances under lockdown or difficult circumstances. I'd like to move on to training, and that was something that you touched on a little in the previous section, but I wanted to ask more specifically what the outcome of the work with Babcock to review your training and deliver sustainable IT-based packages to mitigate the impact on the training, the COVID impact on the training has been. If there's anything more that you'd like to add from your answer in question 2.
I think it's very early on in that review process to be able to give you any definites, but I think the assurance I would provide this committee is that training, like any other aspect of the brigade, is being looked at with a rigour to ensure that we deliver the priorities, both within the transformation plan, but most pointedly that were highlighted in the inspection and inquiry reports. Training sits at the heart of transformation, whether it's around leadership, whether it's around culture, whether it's around our operational delivery. I don't think you can invest too much in training, to be honest with you. I think that's been one of the problems in the past, is that we hadn't always recognised the level of investment that was needed in training. Tim, is there anything you'd like to add? Because again, you're at the heart of this in terms of that review, in terms of bringing in outside scrutiny to consider whether we could do better and more imaginatively in terms of our training delivery.
Tim?
Not too much to add on, Andy. I think you said it right. I think we're having ongoing conversations with Babcock about how they can provide alternative delivery methods. Which is a combination of virtual classroom, virtual or extended reality, simulation scenarios. Just to make sure that the training has resilience, particularly if we see further waves of COVID-19 affect training. We're stepping lots of our critical skills training back up now, and we'll be able to recover some of the ground that we've missed around that. But it's important, I think, that we recognise that the training function within London Fire Brigade has probably grown and developed organically over a number of years. The interface with Babcock could look different. So, you know, just to kind of build on what Andy said then, you know, I've kind of engaged the help of somebody from the Military of Defence who also use Babcock, just to kind of have a look at our training, the interface, and just to kind of, you know, see whether or not, you know, it does what it needs to do in terms of that step change that Andy's described in relation to transformation. And I have to say, both my training team and Babcock are very engaged in that process.
Okay. That's really helpful, and I had the opportunity yesterday actually at a local fire station to see some of the ways in which they're trying to put that into place locally. They're fortunate they have a little bit more space than some of the older fire stations, but that was very impressive, and I got to talk to a number of staff at different levels within the organisation and how they're engaging with it. So thank you. That's very helpful to hear both ends of that story. And finally, on training, did you meet the target to deliver the required training to control room operators? Because that was clearly a recommendation in the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report. And the deadline was June 2020. Were you able to make that?
My understanding is yes, we did. But Richard, can you just confirm that, please, in terms of the detail?
Yeah, certainly. So some of the recommendations was around fire survival guidance within the inquiry. So the Assistant Commissioner for Control and Mobilising has put the plan into place. We're confident that that training has taken place. It also forms part of the recruitment training that is obviously now in place to increase the number of control operators we have. So you know, I can quite happily provide further assurance on the control improvement plan as it progresses. We gave an update at the last FREP meeting, but I will happily confirm all the other actions that have been done.
Well, forgive me, this is my first, so thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
And then just finally moving on to two questions about other service areas, and for the Deputy Mayor, actually, if I may, Fiona. How successful has the P-Smart teams been in strengthening London's capacity to process those COVID deaths and provide that support to bereaved families?
I think I'd just like to sort of add what I said at the beginning about the number of ways that the brigade has supported the work of the COVID-19 response. So PMART was a sort of cross-agency piece of work where you had people coming in from across different agencies to support the process of bereavement in the community. So I think that it was very successful. I think that Tim's already outlined the sort of fact that it is quite a stressful process. But I think that the process, the success of the process was actually reflected in the fact that other parts of the country came to observe and learn. And I had the opportunity to go and talk to PMART teams who were based in the City of London, talk to the people about who were doing the phone calls, and actually sort of hear a debrief about some of the issues they had faced the previous days, so that I got that sort of sense of how it was working in practice. What I met was, from the professional side, was a group of the highly committed professionals. One of the firefighters said, basically, somebody has to, I asked why they'd volunteered to do it. He said, well, somebody had to do it, and I thought it was my opportunity to do something for London. From the volunteers, I met volunteers from Camden Council, from a woman who'd recently retired who was a palliative care specialist, a recently qualified dentist who wasn't able to sort of work because dentists at the time were closed. Hugely committed Londoners, all of whom felt it was really important to play their part in supporting the response to the pandemic. So I think it was effective. They did have to implement learning as they went on, but actually I think the success of the PMART approach, which is there to step back up if it should be required in response to sort of future sort of potential waves was that it really brought together people and added an additional element to making sure that those deaths in the community could be responded to in an appropriate way, bearing in mind the need for it to be sort of COVID secure, and actually sort of to make sure that it was as sort of robust as possible and supported the response overall.
That's really helpful. Thank you. It's been one of the unusual and new parts of the process. I mean, for yourself or for the Commissioner, I mean, on the back of that, how are you going to ensure that welcome support for the ambulance service doesn't affect those core brigade activities going forward?
I think I'll hand over the Commissioner for this, but I think this has been one of the central tenets all the way through. The brigade has only been able to undertake this work because they've had to step back from some of the projects that they would normally undertake in the community, for example, and some of the training. And actually, so the central tenet of being able to do this is that it does not affect core business, and actually the comparatively low levels of sickness compared to what had been predicted may be the case early on has meant that the brigade has been able to step up and do this work throughout this first wave. But I'll hand over to the Commissioner.
Thank you.
I think there's two parts to this answer. The first is it's my intent to carry on our support into the ambulance service, because you can see that this crisis is continuing for the long term, and there would possibly be surges in demand in terms of the support we need to provide other agencies across London. So a drop off and then. So we need to build a system that ensures we can continue to provide our statutory provision, which at the end of the day is the most important thing. As Commissioner, I have, legal and moral obligations to the people of London in terms of delivery of our service, particularly if you again think about the 3rd anniversary of Grenfell. So I know that there will be a way for me to do both, and I'm working with, colleagues in representative bodies and other agencies to find a way that ensure that I've got the capacity in the day-to-day to do what I must do for London and Londoners, and then think of a different way, and again funded by the people who are appropriate to fund it, whether that's health or other parts of, the multi-agency partnership. Those other services that I think we would be foolish to step away from, actually. So I think we've demonstrated the very useful skills that firefighters and the fire brigade have to offer London and Londoners, and we shouldn't shut that down. I hope that's all answers your question. So what I would say is there's detailed planning going on to enable both things to happen.
No, thank you, and it certainly seems to have demonstrated that wider range of skills that firefighters have.
Can I just, sorry to make a kind of administrative point, if you've seen me sort of mouthing and shouting, it's because when I was on mute, it's because my computer is about to turn itself off and go into some sort of refresh. So they're just working to set me up in another room. So if I come off camera for a moment, it's not because I've given up on the committee, and it means you won't witness me throwing the laptop out of the window, and then I'll be in a new room, and you can carry on asking me questions. So sorry about that, but perhaps just a bit of an example of how we're all living in this virtual universe.
Okay,
thank you very much, and thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And could I say, Andy, that on Monday I did a virtual visit to Ilford Ambulance Station and spoke to Nicola, who's a firefighter working on the LAS project, and Charlotte, who's an LAS paramedic, and they're working very well together, and both felt that their skills were enhanced by each other. And what's good, I think, is that they try to keep the same teams together all the time, so they've got a good relationship. And I think the only thing that came out of it was that Charlotte, the paramedic, would quite like to have a go on a fire engine to see the other side of the equation.
Well, you know what? I'm open-minded. I think this is all there to be discussed and debated, actually, in the world we find ourselves in. And I think as long as we do that responsibly with colleagues from, the various trade unions, I think there is opportunity there, personally. I think we need to look in what will be a challenging environment post-COVID about how we really genuinely drive collaboration, because this period of time has shown us what we can do for London and Londoners across the agencies.
Okay, Susan Hall wants to come in.
Thank you. I mean, you've answered some of it. I'm a massive supporter, as you know, of blue light collaboration. It's been incredible what's been going on among the blue light services. Are the unions softening towards the thought of proper blue light collaboration?
I think I've got to recognise that we would not have been able to achieve what we have done in London without their cooperation. And I think that's a good early sign of where these conversations could go. So I think it wouldn't be right to answer on their behalf. They've got their own voice in this. But my sense is, yes, that conversation is more open than it's ever been. And we will continue to work positively and proactively with them to drive that conversation forward and seize those opportunities.
That's good news. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, and David Curtin, you were indicating you might want to come in. David?
Yeah, no need, thank you, Chair.
Okay, in which case we now move on to high-rise firefighting and Leonie Cooper.
Hi, I just need to unmute myself and turn on my camera. Hopefully the Commissioner is not going to suddenly vanish then from one room to another while I'm actually asking you some questions, but we'll have to see how that goes then if your technical issues continue. Whenever we have a discussion with the Fire Brigade, we always have all our acronyms and codes that we have to wade through, and I want to turn to one of them, PN 633, Policy Note 633. I think when we last spoke to you, we were formally in the committee, we were looking at having it published by July of this year, so next month. Now, obviously, there's been one or two things that have been going on since we last had our formal meeting in early March. Are you still on track to publish it in July? And I think we'd be fairly understanding, given what's intervened, if it's going to be delayed, but it would be good to know when that's going to happen.
So, I mean, this speaks to my earlier point around the delay to December, because the training and the policy are interlinked. We can't responsibly implement that policy and procedure until we've trained people sufficiently to do so with confidence in what is a very difficult operating environment. So whilst we've given them a lot of initial guidance about the sort of decisions they might face tonight, and we're in a much better place than we ever were, to fully implement those procedures, we need to bring through the training. So Richard, perhaps you can again give the detail of what that looks like in the timeline across those three policies.
Yeah, certainly. So as I mentioned earlier with regards to the three phases of training, so the specific question you're asking around the policy, policy 633, which is high rise, we've got fire survival guidance policy and the new evacuation rescue policy. What it will enable us to do is provide three training packages simultaneously to the workforce to enable them to make the connection between them, because they are so interlinked. Now, part of that through the computer-based training is being developed, so it'll be between July and December that we'll be rolling out that training, computer-based training, and part of that will also be about a guided learning exercise within that package to consolidate the theoretical part of the policy and to be able to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the workforce of how they apply that in the real environment. Now, that training is going to be provided to all station-based personnel. It's going to be provided to the middle managers as well as principal officers. So any uniform officer that will attend a high-rise incident. Now, when we go through that process, we will make sure that we've got about 80%, no less than 80% of the people that are trained in that and familiar with it before we are satisfied that that can go live, accepting that in that going live there is going to be a second phase, which is about the exercising and testing and the practical application in a real environment, as well as the aspiration for the third phase, which is around the practical firefighting and the urban firefighting course that we wish to develop. So we're at the stage that there will be a delay until the 31st of July, but between the 31st of July to the 31st of December, that period is whilst we will be rolling out that training to deliver that training. So the aspiration is computer-based training will take us to a position where we've got the workforce trained to 80% or more for the 31st of July to then publish that document in its entirety.
So, can I just ask you, I mean, obviously, and I'm asking these questions in the context of the fact that the most recently published figures show that there are still 247 high-rise blocks in London that have aluminium composite material on them, which, you know, is exactly the material that was on the Grenfell Tower, as we know. And, you know, obviously we've now discovered that high pressure laminate HPL material is also, you know, possibly extremely flammable too, because there's been, you know, the fire of a building with that, the student house. So I am asking this in the context of there still being, you know, the potential for similar fires to Grenfell. But of course, you know, there's been a bit of a delay because of COVID-19. Supposing there is another, and you know, I really hope that this doesn't happen, but supposing there's another spike in July or another spike in November, how might that push back your training opportunities, and would that then delay PN 633 and also the associated documents on emergency evacuation and mass rescue?
Okay, so although we're releasing the policies, we have already provided additional awareness training to the workforce. We have talked about for our operational news, which is an internal documentation around firefighting, recognising the signs and symptoms of fire spread, abnormal fire behaviour. So we haven't not done anything to at least increase the awareness of how that operates. The systems we have in place around the number of fire engines that we have going to these types of buildings remains in place, so the predetermined attendance. Assembly member Moore asked a question about some of the work we've done during this period. So high risk activities, high-rise buildings, we've continued to visit those. We've continued to have inspecting officers to go there and make sure that we are very cognizant of those areas, as well as having crews making sure that there remains a waking watch. So, you know, we remain livened up to the fact that, you know, during the periods of COVID, we still need to progress this. Computer-based training, because it is not reliant on face-to-face activities, we can still continue to roll that out. It needs to be recognised in the early stages of COVID. They're quite small teams that have been delivering some of the PPE, and obviously the ambulance assist driving are the same teams that have been working on these policies and the computer-based training. So now we've done that, they're shifting their gaze to elsewhere. A lot of the hard graft, in my view, and it's thanks to my team and the team of the other directors, about laying out how we are setting COVID up for phase 2. In my view, most of it's been done. So they're creating a bit more capacity now to focus on that. So if we go into phase 2 of COVID, I would like to think the issue around testing, the issue around PPE and face masks and supporting the ambulance service, we've done the hard miles in phase 1. So I'm confident that we can continue to deliver against those policies should there be a second spike or a third spike of the pandemic.
Okay, so I'm conscious that I'm asking quite...
Fiona Twycross wanted to come in. Is
that Andrew?
Yeah, Fiona Twycross wanted to come in on that.
Oh, sorry, Fiona, I didn't see you.
Hi, no, it's fine. All I wanted to say was it's an understandable concern that you've raised about sort of, further delays. What I can assure you, and through conversations with the Commissioner, with Richard Mills and with others, is that the Brigade is doing absolutely everything it can to make sure that as far as possible, the pandemic does not put the Brigade's plans off course. However, we have to recognise that we do have a pandemic. We don't know what's going to happen in the autumn, but what I can assure the committee is that as soon as we have any indication that there might be any further delays in implementation of this or any other of the vitally important pieces of work arising from the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the inspection report last year, we will make sure that we keep the committee informed, just as I know the Mayor will keep myself and the Mayor informed, and the Home Office as well, who are understandably concerned to keep up the pace of change.
And Andy's got his hand up. Andy.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think just from my position as Commissioner, what you have in your question, it articulates two great risks to Londoners, doesn't it? It articulates the risk of the pandemic, and it articulates the continuing risk of what is now understood to be a much more dangerous environment for high-rise residents, in particular in London. There is a balance between those two risks and our training and our response, both in terms of risk to vulnerable members of our community and our own staff. What I would say to you is we are doing those hard conversations. And I actually think a bit like armed and public order policing and the military, there will be a point where even if there is a second spike in COVID, even a serious one, we will just deliver this policy and we will deliver large-scale group training, because in the end, you cannot let that risk to London and Londoners by way of the built environment persist, even in the middle of a pandemic. But that is complex and it requires careful conversation with all our stakeholders, both in communities and in trade unions and representative bodies. But I can assure you we are doing that now.
I mean, I'm conscious that I'm asking you, about something that's really difficult. And as you say, I'm saying in the middle of the pandemic, what progress are you making on, something that, was absolutely horrific 3 years ago, almost precisely to the day. But it is obviously an area that we, and I'm very glad to hear that progress is still being made, notwithstanding the very difficult context in which you're operating. One of the things that Richard mentioned was visits, and have any of the section 7.2D visits with that long list of things that need to be looked at, have any of those been held back? And obviously, I presume that we've got enough people who are trained in carrying those out now.
So in respect to 7.2Ds, we never stopped the high-risk 7.2Ds. We never stopped it because, again, this is about this balance between the two great risks, isn't it? So although there is obviously some challenge in doing that in a COVID-19 environment, our professional judgment was that the risk in the built environment outweighed that presented by COVID-19, particularly in respect to the ongoing inspection of high-rise residential buildings. So we just never stopped. Some of those visits in small numbers have been compromised by responsible persons' understandable reluctance to let us into the building to carry it out, and we've had to respect that and work with that and find other solutions. But those have been in the minimum. On the whole, our high-risk visits have carried on in the numbers, and it's demonstrated by the fact that we are confident we will meet those parts of the delivery plan in relation to the recommendations laid down in both the inspection and inquiry reports.
I mean, I referred earlier on, thank you very much for that. I referred earlier on to the fact that the latest figures that came out right at the end of May show that there are still 247 blocks in London that have the aluminium composite material. And last year, the government pledged that ACM would have been removed by now. The target was this month, 3 years on from the Grenfell fire. The other aspect that is really concerning me is that from the time when the government set that target to remove ACM, there are now more privately owned buildings in London, so not ones owned by councils. And, what's the point of us setting a target? Do you think we've really properly learned the lessons of Grenfell when, there seems to be an increase? I personally cannot understand how that has happened. What more can we do from this committee, from you as the brigade, from you as the Deputy Mayor for Fire, to get the message across that ACM should not be going on to the outside of buildings? We need to reduce the number, not have any more.
I think, if I may answer, I think it's in the legislation, actually. So I think, to be fair to central government, this is a wicked problem to solve. And actually, I do think that politicians across the spectrum have absolutely heard and understood the nature of this risk. It's just difficult to resolve in the context of who owns the buildings. Do I think the remediation has been quick enough? No. Do I tell central government that repeatedly? Yes. But I think the key is to work positively with our stakeholders in the Home Office, who are helping move two very important bills through Parliament in respect to building safety and fire safety. We're at the committee stage for one, and we will shortly see the parliamentary beginning of the other. My sense is people are engaged with this. It is just difficult and slow to achieve, but ultimately it will be legislation that drives the greatest change, because then developers, local authorities, those with responsibility for inspection and providing competent persons to do inspection will simply have to fall in line or they'll be breaking the law.
Fiona wanted to come in. Fiona.
I was just going to highlight that we are aware, and it's one of those dreadful knock-on effects of the pandemic. We are aware that the COVID-19 pandemic is having a further impact on remediation progress and timescales. And in April, reflecting the point that the Commissioner made about this being something that politicians of all parties are aware of and want to see progress on, the Mayor signed up to a government pledge alongside other Metro mayors and the National Housing Federation to highlight the fact that cladding remediation counts as emergency safety work, which there had been some confusion about, and should continue where possible during the lockdown. So it is something that's very much on the radar at City Hall, but also just to reassure you, it's something that across all levels of government, people are aware there is still a problem and that this work cannot be delayed because of the pandemic, where other parts of the construction industry understandably and rightly slowed down.
I mean, we have, spoken several times during the course of the pandemic about the fact that construction needs to continue and shouldn't be closed down. This of any area of construction, I think that's very welcome to hear that everyone is signing up to say that these emergency works have got to continue. On the 3rd anniversary of Grenfell, this committee, everybody, involved in this discussion and beyond, the tribute that the people from Grenfell really want is that, that there are not still buildings with this cladding on them, and that others may face what they had to face on that awful night 3 years ago. And we owe it to them. And we also owe it to the Fire Brigade as well, because it's not just about the residents of Grenfell, it's also for the Fire Brigade as well, that we need to be making sure this material is removed as soon as possible. So I think it's something this committee is going to continue to come back to. But thank you very much. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you. David Curtin, did you want to come in on this?
No, thank you, Chair. I'm fine.
Okay. Perhaps I could just follow up with a quick snapshot with Andy and or Richard about equipment procurement which came out of Grenfell. Where are we with the aerial replacement programme? Have we got any of the 64-metre ones in yet?
Richard, I'm going to hand over to you in terms of the detail around timescales, but what I would say as a general point is that it's all progressing in terms of the procurement piece.
Richard?
Yes, it's progressing as planned. We recognise, obviously, COVID, there might be a slight delay in relation to other dependencies like our manufacturers. Nonetheless, we have training planned as of July, so we'll have our first one to enable us to carry out the training around high-rise, and then it will come out, as exactly as the Commissioner said, in line with our scheduled plan of works around our asset refresh generally.
So when do we take delivery of the first 64-metre ladder?
We'll confirm that to you. I haven't got it directly in my head, but I can definitely confirm that to you afterwards.
Okay, and have we got any of the new 32s in service yet?
Service, but we are obviously working towards training as of the 1st of July around those vehicles.
Okay, well, that's good to know. I'm sure that members would like to have a look at either virtually or physically at one of the 64 metres when they come in. Smoke blockers, there was a problem with supply. Has that been sorted now?
Do you want me to cover it, Commissioner?
Yeah. Yes, please, Richard.
Yeah, so it's on the framework. So the provision of smoke blockers, we're actually in the process of procuring more. So it's going through the normal tendering process. They are part of the plan for high-rise policy, as well as increasing the number of fire escape hoods as well. So it is out to tender. We are going through the procurement process for the whole of the fleet to enable those to be made available.
When do you expect to get them? When do you expect to get them? Oh, Andy, yeah.
Sorry, just to come in on that, because actually I've read a bit of detail that had come in only yesterday. I think we've already taken delivery of just over 30 to enable training, and I think a subsequent delivery of over 100, because there's only one manufacturer anyway, is on the stocks, and procurement are putting pressure on the manufacturer to get that delivered as soon as possible. But the production had ceased at one point because of COVID-19. My understanding is they're back in the factory. and they're going to be making them, and we're putting pressure to bring the timescales forward. So there's enough there to train, but now we need them actually on the trucks. That's my understanding of it. Sorry to step across you, Richard.
Thank you. And smoke hoods, you mentioned you're going to buy some more, Richard, and also understand you've got a drone to deliver them.
So we're looking to procure more fire escape hoods to have, in effect, a grab bag available on appliances as part of the high-rise policy. So the grab bags are being made internally by our protective equipment group to facilitate that. The drone, we have carried out a number of trials utilising our drone as a means to deliver various things, for example, fire escape hoods or flotation devices for flood response, those kind of things. So it's something that's being trialled at the moment.
But when will the trials be completed?
I don't have that information to hand, but I can certainly get that for you.
Okay, and the radio replacement programme, the problem of communication we saw at Grenfell, how's that going?
The radio replacement programme, so this is about digitising the radios. They will be going out to tender in July with a plan that they would be introduced in the last quarter of the coming year. As it stands at the moment, we have replaced, I think it's approximately 150 analogue and digital radios on our command units to increase our capability around that. The reason we had a slight delay on that, and I think I said it at one of the recent meetings, Assembly member meetings, was that what we're trying to do is have a radio that has a stronger frequency wave, and that allows us to have obviously a stronger radio that can be used by firefighters. So that is progressing as planned as part of the procurement process.
And BA replacement programme?
So the BA replacement programme, that is continuing. The radios is incorporated into that, as well as the replacement of cylinders as well. So to hand, it's been delivered in a number of phases, radio being the first phase, and then that is going to be carried over in the next couple of years as part of the mapping out of the programme. Cylinders have been incorporated into that because we recognise that with a smaller, more effective cylinder, we may be able to obviously double up the capability with cylinders, and we're also looking at oxygen capability as well. Okay,
so is the EDBA replacement not now going ahead as specifically, or is it rather being folded in?
In the whole replacement project. So we're looking at all elements of respiratory protection.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to go on to financial position, and Susan.
Hello, I don't know if Sue Budden's going to answer this or the Commissioner. First of all, what impact has COVID-19 had on NFB's finances, and are you anticipating any losses? If so, how significant do you expect these to be?
Perhaps if I just start to set the general picture. So yes, COVID-19 has cost us, and yes, I think we will expect to see a gap as a result of that. And now, Sue, perhaps you can give us the detail of those figures, please.
Yeah, certainly. So the forecast cost of our response to COVID-19 is around £5 million. And I've already mentioned the conversations that are going on both the City Hall and the Home Office about potential funding that would contribute towards that and how we might approach working with the LAS in future. In terms of our ongoing financial position, obviously our money comes via the GLA, so we're waiting for the budget guidance, and that will give us some idea of the modelling that City Hall are working on. I think everyone can expect that business rate holidays, council tax holidays, and the sheer cost of the government's wider recovery programme would have some impact on funding availability across the piece, across the public sector. We haven't yet seen what City Hall is modelling and how we might respond to that.
No, we're looking forward to that. I think it's been delayed, which is annoying for all of us. The GLA was awarded £19 million, which is non-ring fenced from the government. How much of that money has been awarded to the NFB?
So we haven't finalised that discussion with them yet. So we do a 2-weekly forecast of costs, which we share through, and those conversations are ongoing.
Okay, and you're having ongoing discussions to try and recoup some of these additional costs?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I got it right earlier. You said you weren't billing the LAS for the work that the firefighters are doing with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the work that we've done to date, we haven't. But as we've said, if we look to extend this, the conversations we're having about extending this, we're looking to talk to the LAS about the extent to which they would help cover our costs. So we mentioned earlier about our ability to do this was because we weren't doing other things. But in future, we want to bring those things back online. Then we would have additional costs, and we'd look for the LAS to work with us on that.
I mean, given you've got an additional cost of 5 million there, would it have been sensible to have looked to putting costings in for what you've done already?
Or with the LAS?
Yeah.
I mean, it could be that we can continue to have that debate with them as time goes on. So I don't feel that we've closed down any option as to how the costs that we've incurred might be funded.
So Andy,
Okay.
Andy wants to come in, Susan.
Okay.
Commissioner.
Yeah, just to be clear, in the conversations I've had with the Chief Executive of the London Ambulance Service, I've been very clear that for us to continue to provide our statutory provision as we must to London and Londoners, the cost must transfer to health. So whilst we're having the conversation about when and how and the mechanics around that, I'm really clear that in respect to our support into the London Ambulance Service, that health is going to have to pay in the end, because otherwise I can't afford to provide my statutory service to Londoners. Gareth absolutely understands that. Yes. In terms of whether we should have done it at the start, I think it's fair to ask that question, but what I would reflect and say is I think at that point, because we had stopped the majority of our non-response core activities, we had the capacity in terms of people available, and we were at a point where the crisis was acute in London, and we just needed to step in and provide that service. And now the conversation is happening about what happens to put that onto a sustainable footing. But absolutely right to ask, Susan.
I think Fiona wanted to come in as well, Susan.
It was a very similar point to the commissioners, to be honest. I think at the point at which the commissioner had his initial conversation with the London Ambulance Service, we were at such a stage of the pandemic that we actually needed people just to get on and sort things out. That isn't to say that people should just get on and sort things out and damage their own budget indefinitely. But I think one of the things that the brigade has been recognised for within the sector, and without wanting to put words in their mouth, by the Home Office as well as obviously by myself and the Mayor, is the incredible way that the London Fire Brigade said, we have a problem, we're here to help sort it out, we're not having to do we can't do quite a lot of the other pieces of work, so we are here for London. So I think that there is a discussion to be had about where the money comes from going forward, recouping the costs that have already been incurred, and as Sue Budden said, these conversations are happening, but I have every absolute confidence that the approach that was taken, that the brigade just stepped up and got on with things and delivered what was needed at the time, was absolutely the right approach, both for the LAS, for the LFB and for London.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I completely agree with you. But at the moment, the hat I'm wearing is looking at the London Fire Brigade and how it's managing its resources. So whilst I agree entirely, we're here to scrutinise what you're doing with your resources. I mean, Her Majesty's Inspector's report stated that it had evidence of the London Fire Brigade being wasteful with its resources. So how are you looking to sort or address that?
So we're looking, obviously working in partnership with stakeholders across both City Hall, central government, our Home Department, the Home Office and the Inspector to really understand what they meant by that. And those conversations are ongoing, and that will feed into our use and planned use of resources. My particular focus is on productivity, because I know that the environment I'm operating in now is very different from what we understood it to be prior to Grenfell. Regardless of whether that was right or wrong, our understanding, but let's be frank, we understand the world we operate in now in a very different way. And now, as we work with a better understanding of COVID, I've got an even different understanding again of the environment I'm operating in and the value that the London Fire Brigade can provide in serving its community. So my focus is very much on what do we do in terms of our resources? What are the services we offer to London and Londoners? How can we ensure that we are being as productive and offer as best value we can? And the planning for that is ongoing and in conversation in every aspect, from the national role maps to how we support colleagues in health, how we support the wider pandemic response, to actually how we measure our statutory provision beyond what is currently a very simple measure around attendance times, for example. How do we measure our reach into communities and the value we're really giving them? How do we increase our offer around fire safety into this now invariably more complicated environment? So they're the thoughts that are ongoing, and they will be embedded in the transformation plan and will be made clear to you in that context.
Yeah, I can see where you're going, but equally we must look after our finances. If we don't, you won't be able to do any of that. And that is fundamental. And Sue Button will tell you her job, making sure we spend the money correctly, is vital so that you can provide everything else. On a final note, it's been something that I've been concerned about. Can you provide an update on the firefighters' pension and the implication that may have on the brigade's finances?
Sue, would you mind, please?
Yeah, certainly. So there's two issues in respect to the firefighters' pension. One is the cost of the pension scheme for us as a result of the last actuarial valuation. So that increased our cost by £25 million. We've had government funding of £21 million to cover the majority of that. But whether that will be continued remains a big question mark for us. So we've been hoping over the last couple of years that it will be sorted through the spending review, but understandably spending reviews have been delayed. So at the moment, that remains a question mark. The other, even more uncertain area is around the case about the discriminatory nature of the pension scheme changes. So it's called the McLeod judgment. So it was decided that there was discrimination on age. The government was refused permission to appeal. So now it's back to an employment tribunal to decide on the remedy for that. We don't know what that looks like, but I would imagine there'd be significant costs that would fall back onto the pension scheme, both in terms of that remedy and also the cost of calculating and arranging that remedy, because it's going to be very, very complex given the amount of time that's passed and the status of the individuals that have retired or chosen not to retire and the various options they took. So I don't have dates for that. And we wait and see how that cost is split between the fire service and government, how it's picked up through future valuations. So the whole area remains very uncertain across those two issues.
And may have a massive impact, which is another reason we've got to watch the pennies and pounds. Okay, I'll leave it at there. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you, Susan. So can I say to our guests, thank you for all your contributions. Can we note the report in today's discussion?
Noted.
Thank you.
Noted.
Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from the meeting?
Agreed.
Agreed.
And lastly, item 10, not quite lastly, can we note the committee work programme as agreed under delegated authority by the chair of the Oversight Committee in May 2020, and the additional activity undertaken since its last meeting, namely informal meetings with the Deputy Mayor and the London Fire Commissioner?
Noted.
Thank you. Date of next meeting. Next meeting will be confirmed in due course by the Assembly. And any other urgent business, I haven't got any. So that brings us to the end of the meeting. Thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you.